Welcome to the Fantasy Source Football Podcast. My name is David A. Arnott, sitting here with George Winkler, and we had a fascinating weekend of fantasy football. Randy Moss returning to the Minnesota Vikings, the Monday night game, delayed by lightning for about 40 minutes, so I was just very confused when I tuned in after the Giants game, and it was barely even as far as it was. I think we saw what we expected to see from Brett Favre, didn't we? That he had kind of difficulty throwing the ball deep until he just let loose with one throw that kind of went down there.
Yeah, I mean, there was a delay to the game, and it seemed like Favre delayed even further because he didn't really show up in the first half. And then all of a sudden he drops that teardrop into Randy Moss, and things start to pick up. Percy Harvin getting open because Moss is drawing the deep coverage, and it was a very impressive performance, given that Moss doesn't even know all the plays yet.
Yeah, I mean, it's not. I think he talked about it afterwards. It's not even knowing the playbook or anything like that. It's knowing all the little things, hand signals, audibles, every single thing you could possibly get to know about a quarterback that you get pretty much from playing with them for months during preseason.
Yeah, and, Randy Moss probably doesn't need to know a lot of the playbook. You can just go deep and you can throw it up to him and make a pretty good living doing that. But I think that they will get better and better as the weeks go on. The one guy that kind of you're concerned about coming out of this is Shenko, the tight end. He kind of was the third banana now, and maybe Moss takes away some of his red zone looks as well.
Yeah, I mean, Visanti Shenko has made his bones as a fantasy tight end at least, by getting touchdowns and being that red zone target. I think he had 7 last year, something along those lines, even though he only had 42 receptions or thereabouts. He was a pretty valuable tight end, especially mid-level, bottom 12 in those 12-team leagues, made him draftable. And it's one of those things where now if you've got Harvin and you've got Randy Moss and then you've got Adrian Peterson, somebody's got to score touchdowns. If you've got those guys as your choices, why would you choose Visanti Shenko?
There's another mouth to feed, and it's not Bernard Berrien, and Berrien's going to the bench with Moss there, obviously. But yeah, Shenko is now a tight end too, I view him as. And, Favre still has a history of going to the tight ends and making them valuable, but he's going to fall in love going to Moss and Harvin, I think.
I love that you said making a tight end valuable, because in the Sporting News Experts League, and I was bragging about this because I've beaten you twice already this year, I have Antonio Gates. And in our scoring, Gates, it's a non-PPR league, just so everybody knows. Gates has scored 89 fantasy points on the season. The next highest tight end, I believe, is Tony Moiati of the Chiefs. It could be somebody else, but it's at 56 points. So he's 30-something points up, almost 40 points up, it feels like at least, on the next highest tight end. And then I would argue that if you knew that before the season, Antonio Gates, and your season's only 5 weeks long, then Antonio Gates would be the number one pick. He would have to be the number one pick at that point, because if you're getting that kind of advantage on a game-to-game basis at any one position, then that makes up for any deficiencies you might have at other positions. Like, for instance, when I'm starting Jason Avant, Jabbar, Gaffney, the likes of those guys and my wide receivers, it doesn't really matter because Gates is completely destroying his opposing tight end.
Yes, you had to bring up Antonio Gates. You did get me with the Rivers-Gates combo for 2 weeks. I would like to also point out those are the 2 weeks when Chris Johnson showed up too, yes. And he's also on your team, so I was really in for it. But, Gates is scoring 6 more points a game than the next highest competition, which is Dustin Keller. There's nobody doing that across any position. So, Arian Foster might be the closest guy in the MVP race right now in fantasy leagues, but he's not really close to Antonio Gates.
I mean, Foster would have, in this mythical fantasy MVP discussion, would have a lot of support because he was a mid to late round pick, I would guess. A lot of people, the more knowledgeable sharks in the fantasy world, would have been beating on him as a guy that they wanted as their running back 2, perhaps, or maybe even a third running back. But he's turned out to be a stalwart as a running back 1. That makes him valuable. Everyone knows about Gates, though. Everyone knows about the tight ends and knows the tight end is a shallow position. And then if you get a tight end who's puts up numbers like a wide receiver, or for that matter, like the number 1 wide receiver in the game, then all of a sudden you've got something extremely valuable. Now, here's my question for you, though. Do you think that that's something to, in a larger picture, take into account when you're drafting in future years? The idea that, I mean, maybe we should revisit this next year when it's time to draft, but this also does apply when you're talking about trades. Do you think I'm being hyperbolic when I say that Antonio Gates really might be the most valuable player in all of fantasy right now?
I don't think you're being hyperbolic at all right now, but Antonio Gates has had great seasons before, and there's no way to know if he's going to keep this pace up. He's on a crazy pace right now, and for him to go on and score 20 touchdowns, if he does that, then yeah, he's the MVP.
He might be the league MVP.
He's the guy. I draft him first overall next year.
And he might be the league MVP if he does that.
He might be, but depending on if the Chargers can win some games, but. Yeah, Antonio Gates, he's there. He's done it before, and I think we get lulled to sleep with guys like that sometimes. Oh, they're the boring pick. They're not as exciting as Jermichael Finley. Mm-hmm. Well, how are people feeling about Jermichael Finley now? I'm feeling pretty terrible because I drafted him in the 5th round in one league.
Yeah, I mean, Jermichael Finley. That's the other thing about it is that if you do draft, say, Antonio Gates, let's say you draft him in the 2nd round, right? Because you truly believe in Antonio Gates being an extremely valuable player compared to everyone else. Well, there's a reason why he's not drafted higher. And to take a baseball example, Tim Lincecum might have been the most valuable player in fantasy baseball 2 years ago, but you don't draft him number 1 overall because the drop-off from him to the next guy or to Lincecum just being average or Gates dropping off a little bit, suddenly all that value gets lost. And it's not anything that you did. It's just because you're not going to be able to replace it at all.
Yeah, and I think Gates is the space between him and the other guys will come down for the rest of the season. And I got to say, every time I've drafted a quarterback or a tight end early, or even worse, combined them both, I have a terrible season. So I keep coming back to the running back, wide receiver, running back, wide receiver. It's just what has worked for me. I'm not saying you can't do it with Gates and a quarterback, but like I did Finley and Schaub in one league, got them in the first 5 rounds. Not working out so well in that league right now. So.
Well, I mean, Schaub's not going to throw for 5,000 yards. I mean, and the big problem to me is that I have this tension where I see that the world goes with their 2 running backs, maybe draft a quarterback or a wide receiver. After that, maybe get your 3rd running back within the first 6 rounds type strategy. That seems to be like the standard strategy in a non-PPR league especially. Well, there might be some mathematical reasoning why you would go after, say, Antonio Gates if you can get him, but I have that emotional pull telling me there must be a reason why nobody does that. Why people don't get that tight end or on down the list.
I think it's because you grew up in Northern California and you got that spirit of wanting to be different, and you want to do something different and win the league a different way. I understand that because I'm from there too.
Well, George, I will try not to be different moving forward because I'm winning, and that's what's most important right now. So, all right, thanks for joining us on the podcast.
All right.